This is Starchild, Primordial Reborn. It is huge. Not in any sense that we can comprehend, but huge in that even the stars among the sky, the planets in their orbits, and the mass vortex that binds them all together dwindles in comparison. Its form is unimaginable, stretching far and wide, encompassing the galaxy in its gaping jaws. It is old, an ancient presence in existence long before the birth of our race, before the life of our planet, and perhaps even before the formation of our galaxy. It is a god by the means of men, a mistaken identity, and a presumption of divinity. It is an object of worship only by a species that has the capacity to be aware of its own existence. Its composition is altered entirely by our spontaneous emotions, our ill desires, and most of all, our misguided faiths. It is a being of the astral, a chaotic realm of existence that sings harmonious melodies of peace, and thirsts for the sadistic revelries of horror. It is the fabrication of our imaginations, and we are the conduit of its existence. Long-reaching nebulas like the paws of a feral beast, or the tendrils of a vile sea serpent are reaching out across our planar of existence and into the heart of our star system. Its form is passing through the voids of uninhabitable planets, and through the warm glow of our sun as it seeks out the orbs that sustains billions upon billions of lives, and wraps its feral tongue around its crust. It thirsted for us, my child, and only we can put out the flame that gives it life. "Derek Kaon!" shouted my teacher, who stood at the front of the classroom in a boiling rage. She was layered under tundras of chalk dust that resided on the upper side of her wide and encompassing midsection, forcing a strong resemblance, both in shape and in color, to that of a bulky, wintry snowman. Although, had she have been a real snowman, the conjuration of such rage would have likely melted her into a bubbling pool of liquid, freeing the classroom from her boring, deep sleep-inducing lectures. Though jollier in her size, this instructor was by no means full of holiday cheer. Her goal was numbers, and much like the sequential math problem she decorated across her blackboard, we students weren't much else besides variables that indicated various levels of success. I was a negative exponent, and threw off her correlated trend of passing students by a wide margin. She wore a deceivingly friendly-looking dress that splayed curtain-like drapings from her muffin-top figure, a look that suggested she was attending an eloquent dance as a well-fed honorary guest, rather than a middle school classroom teacher. Her voice was stern and shook with anger, but only a student with the finest senses could hint the subtle remark of joy on her tongue. My vision was fogged as though surfacing from heavily chlorinated water, and my sight was lost in a color spectrum that was not familiar to any human eye. The wariness in my vision drew a strange foreignness to the over-vibrant classroom that made up my educational surroundings. Motivational posters that had intelligent animated animal characters shouting words of encouragement were plastered on the walls, along with equations and mathematical algorithms that I never truly took notice of until that moment, as I tried to focus coherence into my environment. I couldn't say how long I was out for, and for that matter, how long Mrs. Peterson was shouting my name, but I knew that I had to get back to reality, and that would take a little more time. Time I wasn't sure I had. "Derek!" she bellowed out with a resounding similarity to that of a cannon initiating the start of a race, and she began marching towards me with hot anger curdling at her toes. I felt my physical body come back to life, placing me back in control of my limbs, and I quickly sat up in my chair, replicating a posture of assurance, as though I had never previously stirred from that position. I looked back and forth and saw every one of my classmates staring at me in mild amusement, all drawing the assumption that I was intentionally ignoring the teacher for comical reasons. The normal dozed-off students were now sitting straight with their spines erect, their minds alert, and their eyes wide open in sudden wakefulness, as their teacher used her outdoor voice to get my attention. Each were desperately hoping to avoid her wrath, and some even lowered their heads as though they could simply hide from her piercing gaze. "What?" I shouted to Mrs. Peterson, responding in hostility as her projected voice had startled me to the point of aggravated alertness, and the strength to conjure my voice now fully expelled the words I had been waiting to say in an unpredictably loud volume. As she drew closer with each bestial step, the atmosphere of the room grew heavy, and every student within the classroom carefully noted their teacher's twisted facial expression. Her march towards me entailed fluttering chalk-filled clouds with every step. Their gaseous forms grew out from her sides like poisonous smog, choking the students unfortunately placed to the sides of the narrow row she was attempting to squeeze through. She had stopped suddenly when the context of what I had said and the attitude coupled with it smacked her straight in the face, and right when I thought the bloodshot red across her face couldn't grow any darker. It had. "No daydreaming in my classroom, young man," she began, slamming down her pointer finger like the mallet of a courtroom judge. "I could produce a slip this very instant that will send you right back to the principal's office," she threatened, referring to me as though I was some byproduct of the higher administration. It was still the first week of school, and she had already slapped a negative stereotype on me, profiling my likely relationship with her for the remainder of the year. Her threats were already growing old, and her belligerent reactions to my remarks weren't much to get excited over, though the cascade of constantly changing colors in her face and the frequent bulging of arterial veins continued to be amusing. Mrs. Peterson had sent me to the principal's office the very first day of class, which wasn't long ago, considering this was still the first week of school. She thought, with her academically primed brain power, it set a good example for myself and the other students who were now new to the middle school, and more specifically, new to her classroom. She wasn't aware that I knew just how much the principal really despised her for being unable to handle her own students, especially on the introductory day. He, the boss man of the middle school, must have spoken to her about his take on the situation and how he disliked her jumpy decisions because I felt her reluctance to act on her own threat, and her rampaging, preemptive accusations had halted at the forefront of her thoughts. "I wasn't daydreaming," I spat back unconvincingly. "Then what is the answer to the questions on the board?" Mrs. Peterson tried concealing her smile, thinking she had me cornered. I kept my head straight, as I knew the very instant I turned it to either side, she'd suspect me of gazing over other people's work. She was relying on the fact that I'd do just that so she could dismiss my attempt before I gave out whatever sarcastic answer I may have had waiting. I didn't even bother to look at the blackboard positioned on the wall behind her, as it wouldn't have done me much good, for the problem was beyond my will to comprehend. Fortunately for me, Mrs. Peterson looked down into her thick, heavy-set answer booklet which held all of her well-guarded secrets, and there it was in plain view. My answer. She might as well have just read it out loud, for it only took me a microsecond to skim the surface of her thoughts and find it waiting there, nearly screaming its presence to me. 23, Mrs. Peterson, I said, with a strong roll of the eyes as if all these lessons were just too easy for me. Well, they were, after all, but that didn't explain my hurting grades. My over-authoritarian teacher looked back down into her guide booklet for a quick second, as if to confirm the answer was right, and that she had originally read it correctly. The expression of shock only showed briefly on her face, but remained in the emotional centers of her brain as she looked back up without any visual expression of approval. "Correct," she stated without sounding satisfied before she sharply turned her back to me like an upset teenager who didn't get her way. The lesson plan was to be taught, not to be already known by her students, and her demand for me to solve the equation was meant to be a stumping question that would have led us through an explanation of how to. I circumvented that obstacle, without much more than a thought about it, and now her lesson plan was foiled. The students around the room still stared on, mainly those who had never met me before, were trying to comprehend the unusual contradictions between my behavior. They had all assumed that my early outward defiance was an indication of stupidity, and that I was bound to answer the spontaneous question incorrectly, or use the opportunity for another statement of rebellion. My unexpected and by all means correct answer to the impossible question left my fellow students, to develop an opinion that I was peculiarly strange, and they were certainly correct. I sunk back into my chair and pressed my palms against the temples of my head as I was still in the process of recovering from the lapse in conscience I suffered only minutes ago. I took a mental note. Never doze off in class again. I am Derek Kayon, and I am a struggling 6th grader in the Keller Middle School, and my difficulties in academics are the least of my concerns. I view the world drastically different than my peers, and this is something I am only suddenly becoming aware of. I don't wish harm upon anyone, but I am young and naive, and it is quite difficult to overcome the nature of biology. My birth into this world was delivered in a blast of overexcited neurons, or at least that is what the doctor had stated as an explanation to my father when he watched my mother convulse violently for 3 minutes before passing away. This was shortly after I was born. My father had been a happy man, or at least that is what everyone had said before my birth and the sudden unexpected death of my mother. Ever since the tragedy, his evenings were spent slogging down buckets of intoxicating liquids in the false hopes that perhaps after one of these deep nauseating blackouts, he would wake to find it all was just a dream. I knew such things were not going to happen. Christine is my older sister and is ahead of me by 6 years. She said things were different before I was born. She said how our father was so cheery at the time and how much fun it used to be around him. She would always speak of our mother, of her looks and her flourishing character. I had a feeling most of these qualities were simply speculation. After all, how many things can one really remember from the beginning of their life? I never could read my sister like I could other people. I always was gifted when it came to knowing things, feeling emotions in others, and seeing their true intent. But not with her. She was always a cloud of mystery, as though her thoughts were simply quieter than others, as though her eyes were hidden behind tinted glass. This obviously caused a major dilemma in my life, as my sister oftentimes prevented me from getting away with anything and everything, as I never really could influence her the way I could others. But she does have a positive side to things. It was always calm around her. People's worries were less bothersome, my imagination was less crazy, and I rarely suffered from the strange delusions induced by something as little as a nap. This is always when I was by her side. She was like an air of silence, and falling asleep on her lap was a promise of a restful sleep. But her teenage years are distancing her from me, and her tranquil presence is slowly fading. It is becoming a fashionable decree to ignore me as her little brother and to regard me as a pestering presence instead. Little does she know, her growing distance was igniting a flame that would be seen by many, far beyond the spectrum in which our eyes are so limited by. Predators loom to distinguish such a light in the void of darkness, but in the vacuum of space and outside the tranquil calm brought by my kin, the flame would be given the space to grow. Our mother had many wishes for us, all passed down through our father in mysterious fashion as though she knew she would not be here in my life. Jewelry being one of them, without an explained significance beyond, I would like for the children to wear these. She wanted Christine to be close to me, telling her to care for me as she had done so well, to always keep Derek by your side. A wish that my sister took very literally, as throughout my younger years she'd always be there, and even in the midst of night, she would silence the universe. However, my mother's wishes could only remain so long before age and time had us grow distant, and the nights I spent alone immersed me in a world unlike any other. That's when the terrors began. I had never met my mother, though it feels like we've spent a long time together. Photos and old videos never did me much good, as they hardly showed me who she truly was. They were all just images, and they lacked the ambient wakes that evoked from the flesh of our being. I was told I had a lot of her features, from the sharp nose to my cheeks. Having heterochromia, one of my eyes are a different color than the other, so I apparently had one of her eyes, and the streaking blonde highlights mixed into my typically straight brown hair were also considered to be from her. It certainly is never a comfortable position when people are staring into your face and claiming different components of you are from somebody else. But I guess the resemblance I bore offered reminiscence to my family, and so I endured the longing stares that dared use me as a mirror to the past. My sister and my father would speak of her as though she were some great saint who died for the sins of man. I, for whatever reason, felt as though I was that sin. They would tell me everything about her, as though trying to make up for the fact that I would never get to meet her, or to further guilt me into the belief that my birth resulted in her death. It was always heavily awkward to sit through the tales of her life, as I seemed to be the focal point of attention during these times. Blame always settled on my shoulders, as though the joy she had brought others had vanished the moment I had come into existence. People spoke of her smile, her scent, and her character, but all of that I already knew. In fact, there wasn't a single detail about her I didn't already know. After all, she refused to leave me alone.